What is the scariest paranormal experience you've had in your life? Story 1. I was having a tense conversation with someone that I was close to years ago. The conversation quickly devolved into a passive-aggressive fight that ended with the other person getting in the car and driving away. As I started heading back inside, the person came back, got out of the car, and started our conversation again. The tone of voice was totally different and the stance was different too. The feeling in the air was completely off and I don't know how else to explain it. As the conversation progressed, the person started saying some nasty and mean things that were completely out of character. I said, "This isn't like you." They said, "What makes you think that I'm him?" I remember continuing the conversation and talking to the person for a long time, but I don't remember anything specific. I do remember becoming more and more alarmed and knowing something wasn't right. Finally, I told the person to go home. He complied and left. I went back inside and started telling my sibling about the situation when the doorbell rang. Maybe 2 to 3 minutes had passed. It was the first person coming back to apologize for the original fight. He had been driving around town for a long time and didn't want to go home, leaving things unresolved. I asked why he had said some of the things from the last conversation and he looked at me like I was crazy. He had no idea what I was talking about. Totally could have been lying, but that whole situation just felt dark. Scared the hell out of me. Story 2. I was living with my now mother-in-law in a house she had just purchased a few months before. We all had various weird feelings or experiences in the house, but this one really sticks out. Collectively, there were 3 dogs living in the house at the time. One evening we are all sitting with our backs to the hallway watching a movie. All of a sudden my German Shepherd and my terrier both perked up their ears and started staring down the hallway behind where we were sitting. And I mean, full attention. I noticed and turned around. The light in the hall was off and it was dark, so of course I don't see anything. 5 minutes later, they are still staring and now growling. This time my wife and I turn around and we both watch as the light switch gets flipped on. The dogs went crazy and so did we. A few weeks later, same scenario, light was off and we are watching a movie. My German Shepherd loved to play fetch and we always had a million balls around to entertain her. This time, she's staring down the hallway and wagging her dang tail. We all notice again and started to watch. I swear to God, a ball, single orange tennis ball, came rolling down the hallway towards her. We all went white. There were a few others, but goodness, I hated that hallway. It never felt like a bad energy, but my feeble little brain was still scared nonetheless. Story 3. In the house I grew up in, it always felt like you were being watched. I'd see shadows out of the corner of my eye and dark mists that would dissolve when you looked straight at them. My older sister was always scared of the attic, especially. She would barricade the door when we were left home alone. I went in the attic quite often to get various things. It's where we kept large toy containers, old clothes and stuffed animals, and I just liked seeing what I could find. However, it always felt like I was being watched. One time I went up there, and as I reached the top of the stairs, I saw a large, translucent alien-shaped white head looking at me from behind a box. I froze, terrified, and locked eyes with it for a few seconds before it slowly lowered itself down to hide. I turned right back around and left, telling myself I had imagined it, but scared to go in the attic for years after that. I didn't tell anyone for years. My parents eventually sold the house and we moved, and I've never felt the same way anywhere else I've lived. Story 4. One afternoon in college I came back from classes and decided to sit on the couch and have a snack. After that I just passed out. I had a nightmare of some bloody-faced demon screaming in my ear at the top of its lungs. I woke up and went about the rest of my day. My roommate comes back later that night and goes into his room as I'm sitting in the main living area. At some point he lets out this random startled scream, which led me to start running down the hall to see what's going on. He looks at me and goes, "I swear to God, someone with a bloody face just walked from your bedroom into the bathroom." I never told him about my nightmare I had earlier in the day. I didn't sleep for 2 days. Fortunately, nothing ever happened again. Story 5. I got home from work very early in the morning around 2:30 a.m. My house has an entryway or mudroom before you actually get into the house. I opened the front door, stepped inside, closed the front door, and proceeded to try and find the key to get through the next door to get into my house. So the only light in this entryway is through the glass on the front door. The rest of the room is completely black and I can barely see my hands in front of my face. All of a sudden I start to hear this buzzing or vibrating noise behind me off to the right. The house is old, so I thought maybe they are just weird house noises. I was still looking for the key when I noticed that the noise is getting louder, closer, and it has risen in pitch to something like a woman was humming loudly. Maybe it's just ringing in my ear. Out of the corner of my eye, I see a shadow that I thought was from the light reflecting outside move towards me, creeping along the wall. That's when I noticed the vibrating noise was also getting closer to me, and it seemed to be coming in the same direction as the now moving shadow. I'm crapping my pants trying to open this dang door, and when I finally do, the noise stops, the shadow disappears, and I'm hoping it was all in my head. Story 6. My grandfather passed away when I was 8 and my little brother was around 2 or 3. He had this big lazy boy chair in the living room that he always planted himself in. Everyone knew this chair was Grandpa's chair. Anyway, we went down to my grandparents' house in Florida for a long weekend to attend the funeral. We were all chatting the first night there in the living room, and my mom was sitting in the lazy boy chair. My little brother goes up to my mom and says Grandpa wants his chair back. My mom asks him where Grandpa is, thinking he probably didn't understand death, to which he responds, "He's right behind you." Story 7. I dropped my mug onto the floor accidentally. Heard no noise when it hit the floor. When I went to pick it up, it was gone. I honestly went to bed and pondered what happened and slept feeling incredibly uncomfortable. Story 8. I was sleeping in my basement, which was pretty much my bedroom, and I woke up at some random time in the night for no apparent reason. Rolled over and saw a black figure, probably around 5 feet 10 inches and typical male physique, standing at the side of my bed. It was standing between the bed and the stairs, so there was no way to nope out, so I just rolled over and straight up started praying. I rolled back over and it was gone. The next morning I was in the shower, also in the basement, and the curtain was pushed to the side, not like all the way, but it noticeably moved. Then when I got out of the shower, my cello's D string was plucked 3 times, then wrung out, which was laying against my chair in the basement. Then I went upstairs and my brother had a handprint that reached across his neck and cheek. It was too big to be his hand, but he was perfectly fine and he slept through the night uninterrupted. Story 9. In my previous job, when our building was still under construction, the only floors that were occupied were the 1st, 2nd, 5th, 6th and the 7th. One time I was alone inside the elevator going from the 1st to the 6th floor when suddenly it stopped and opened on the 3rd floor. Normally I would just disregard it, but there were rumors all over that a ghost child was playing around on the vacant floors. So I pressed the closed button as fast as I could. When it closed, I heard noises like someone was tapping their fingers on the walls of the elevator. Story 10. In a slow-moving journey through time, you come across a scene where a famous painter is lying on his back, painting the ceiling of a building. There is a ladder going up to that scene, and the rumor was that a maintenance guy had a heart attack during his shift one night and dropped at the base of the ladder. No one found him until the next morning, and he was already dead. It became a tradition upon closing the ride for the night to tell him good night, or else havoc would come down upon the ride the next day. Silly, I know, but we all played along. I never really believed in it, everything seemed very circumstantial. On one particularly slow day, I was riding through the attraction when all of a sudden it stopped in that scene I mentioned earlier. Now, if you've ridden this ride, you'll know that it's basically a train car with 2 rows. Well, as far as I could see ahead of me, there was no one. As far as I could see behind me, there was no one. The ride system is pretty sophisticated. When someone hops out, there are pressure-sensitive mats on one side that trigger the ride to stop and show on our ride display screen exactly where it is. On the other side of the ride vehicle, there are photoelectric beams that also give the exact location of this intrusion, as we call them. Now we stop this ride pretty often. Someone takes too long to get into the ride vehicle, stop it and then start it back up again. Well, in this case, they started speaking over the intercom into the entire ride. That usually means someone is out of a vehicle somewhere on the ride. A few minutes into sitting there, I start to hear keys jingling, 2 sets headed in my direction. I'm completely alone, and here come my fellow mouse employees, looking rather concerned. "Hey, did you jump out?" Of course, I hadn't, to which I told them. They look at each other and back at me, both looking from the opposite directions they've come from. "Did you see anyone?" I hadn't. It was just me. The mat and the I-beam were both triggered in this scene. They said we all sort of stare at each other and sort of whisper the ghost's name at each other. They leave, and within 5 minutes, we are moving again, but I never rode alone again. Story 11. I had a dream when I was 3 years old about being chased through an old house by a man with a chainsaw. The old green walls and wooden floors are still ingrained in my memory. My only escape was hopping from the second floor down to the first, where I was teleported back in bed with my parents. The particularly spooky part didn't come until years later. My family went on vacation for spring break to some town along the coast. We stayed in a home that was part of an older settlement in Washington state. Upon entering the house, I was freaked out. It was the exact home I had dreamed of years ago, right down to the walls and the staircase. I felt exceedingly uncomfortable during our entire stay. I read in a book a long while later that, unbeknownst to my parents, the neighborhood we were staying in is notably haunted due to some killings that took place there in the 1800s. Story 12. My dad used to work at the local library. Oftentimes he would stay until late working when no one was there but him. One day he told me he would hear loud crashes upstairs, but when he would go look to see what had fallen, there wasn't anything out of place. He told me about this, and we decided to go take pictures and ask questions while using a digital audio recorder. The following happened on 2 separate occasions. One night, while using the recorder, we asked the standard slew of questions and eventually headed home and listened back to the recording. At some point in the recording, a whisper could be heard saying 1 and 1 is 2. I never knew what that meant, but it was just the two of us there, so I always assumed that's what the voice was referring to. On another night, we were sitting on the main floor in some chairs using the recorder and asking questions. One of the questions I asked was, "Do you like books?" Right after I finished asking the question, we heard an unusually large crash behind us. We were pretty unnerved and decided to just leave. This was a Saturday night. The library was closed on Sunday, so we went back to the library the next morning to see what had made the noise. A couple of rows of books behind where we had been sitting, there was a book on the floor, laying open and face down. I picked the book up, and the first word on the page it was open to was our last name. The book also had the word murder in the title. We were sufficiently freaked out. Story 13. I ordered a really cool stereo by mail. My older brother said he'd assemble it when it arrived. I told him all I wanted to hear on that stereo was Heartbreaker by Led Zeppelin. Came home one day from work and heard that song wailing through the streets from 2 blocks away, and I knew my stereo had arrived. Years later, after my brother passed away, I decided to unbox and use his very expensive stereo system. Realized I couldn't put it together, so I hired a guy to do it for $50. While he was putting it together, I was telling him about my Heartbreaker old stereo story. He finally said, "Okay, when I put this last wire it should work." As you can guess, the song that came blasting out of those awesome Bose speakers was Heartbreaker. That guy freaked out and flew out of my house. He didn't take his money, didn't say goodbye, he was just gone. I still miss my brother some 30 years later. I have other stories, but that's my fave. Story 14. Got lost with my girlfriend at night in Waco, Texas. Roads were deserted, so no people, no cars. Then we saw one lone person standing on the corner as I made a turn. I heard a friendly male voice in the vehicle, as if sitting in the back seat, say to me, "You're going the wrong way." I noticed I was, indeed, going the wrong way on a one-way street, so I did a U-turn. The road took me directly to the main highway. Asked my girlfriend a bit later if she heard the voice too, and she burst into tears because she had been so freaked out by it she thought she was going insane. Story 15. I grew up in a haunted house, so spooky things happened all the time, and the absolute scariest thing that ever happened unfortunately happened about once a week. If you were sitting in our living room, you could see straight down our hallway to my bedroom door. It was pretty dark at the end of the hall, but you could usually make out my doorway and the doors on either side and the pictures and things hanging on the wall. When the dark came, however, it was like someone dropped a black curtain over the end of the hall. You could still see about halfway down the hall, but beyond that, you might as well be looking into a black hole. When the dark came, it was always accompanied by this intense, uncomfortable feeling of being watched. Our family's 3 dogs would stare down the hallway and growl, and occasionally one of them would get brave enough to walk a little way down the hall, but they always came backing slowly out like they were afraid to turn their back on the dark. After a little while, usually a few minutes to half an hour, the darkness would suddenly disappear and you could see again. Sometimes, however, it would linger all night, and since nobody wanted to walk through the dark to get to the bedrooms, my whole family would be stuck in the living room all night. Story 16. When I was around 12, my mother had to go out of town for a bit and she left me home alone for a few days. She refused to give me a mobile phone because she figured she could just call me on the landline if anything came up. She told me the date when she'd be back, and that was that. The date arrives and I hear my mom knocking on the door downstairs, calling my name. My dog, who loved her, got excited when she heard her voice and ran down ahead to greet her. She got to the door, freaked the hell out, and ran back upstairs to me. I refused to go down and open the door. The phone started ringing and the knocking stopped. I picked up the phone to hear my mom say, "I'm sorry, I have to stay one more day here. I'll head home tomorrow." Story 17. I used to have this reoccurring dream where this black figure with no face would visit me and try to possess me. It would typically enter my being through my mouth, and at that point I would have no control over my dream. It would tell me to do terrible things to people, and it had a scratchy voice. The weirdest part that every time it would be inside me, I physically would feel ill. I would wake up with the same feeling, oftentimes vomiting right away. The last time this happened must have been 3 years ago. If you've gotten this far and enjoying the content, please leave a comment of your own story. We'd love to make a video of them in the future. Story 18. When I was in elementary school, I shared a queen-size bed with my older sister and our family dog, who would sleep at the foot of our bed every night. When I was about 6 years old, I woke up one night around midnight and saw a dark figure standing at the foot of the bed. The figure was entirely in black without any eyes or a face. I tried to wake my sister up, but she rolled over to go back to sleep. My sister must have accidentally kicked the dog, because the dog woke up and raised her head and started growling at the figure. The growling then woke my sister up, and when she saw the figure, she started screaming. When my parents came into the room and turned the light on, nothing was there. To this day, both my sister and I are adamant that we saw a ghost or demon in our room. We know we aren't crazy because the dog saw it too. Story 19. I went with my best friend during high school for summer vacation to his grandparents who live in the countryside in Japan. I stayed in his mom's old room, which has a small wall closet. Just above this closet was a smaller closet door, like 1.5 feet tall and about 3 feet wide, just above it. Weird design, but their house is old. The first couple of weeks, I was pretty jet-lagged, and Japan is hot and humid, so I didn't really sleep at night. If my light was off at night though, I always felt uneasy about that small closet space. Something about it just felt darker than the rest of the room. Toward the end of the second week, I started to adjust to the time difference. One morning, I woke up and that small door was open. It was unsettling, but I closed it and just thought maybe it wasn't closed all the way and came loose. A couple nights later, I woke up feeling uneasy. It was dark and I could barely see, but I could see that small door was open. It was much darker than the rest of the room, like black, pitch dark. This was the first and only time I experienced paralysis. I was too scared to move, say, or do anything. I just felt this darkness coming from there. I don't remember sleeping that night, but I must have, because I remember waking up the next morning. I told my friend about it, who said his mom told him about something like that too. When we got back home and I talked to his parents, his mom kinda joked with me, "So, I heard you met the ghost." Story 20. My brother was on the phone once with his girlfriend when she started saying that she could hear some old lady asking my brother for a glass of water. There was nobody around him, so he ignored it, but she kept on insisting. He hung up the phone and went to check on our grandma, who was in her bedroom, and found her dead. Fast forward a couple of years, around 11 p.m, I was on the phone with a girl when I saw a guy on a bicycle go past. That's when I noticed she stopped talking and I asked her if she was still there. She apologized as she thought I got into trouble. I said no and asked why she said that, and she replied with, "Someone was telling me to stop talking on the phone, it's late. Go to bed." I was on my own, everybody in the house was already asleep. I asked her if it was an old lady and she said yes. Told her it's my grandma and that the same thing happened to my brother. She started talking about ghosts and stuff, so I told her I'm hanging up and bolted into my room. Story 21. My dad was in hospital with a serious brain tumor. The hospital was about 40 miles from me and he was in no shape to even keep awake. One night I was chatting to a friend on MSN and he asked how my dad was. I turned to my left and I saw him sat in his chair just looking at me. I replied, "I think he's okay, he's sat in the room with me," to which my friend said, "Isn't he in the hospital?" I looked again and nothing, he was gone. I never mentioned it to anyone, told my friend I must have been seeing things. Dad survived and still here today. Cut to about 21 years later and I met up with my dad and we were just having a chat. He says, "Something's been on my mind for years, son, and I can't shake it off. When I was in the hospital, I remember being at home sitting in my chair and you were on the computer and you looked at me. I woke up in the hospital, but it felt too real to be a dream." That's when I told him my experience. Story 22. When I was 6, I slept on a bunk bed in a room alone. The bottom bunk was empty, which was meant for my younger brother, but he was too scared to sleep in a bed alone. So I was alone in that room that night. I remember a chilling feeling, then it suddenly got really warm, probably because I was undergoing a night terror of some sort. Then I start breathing heavily and open my eyes and see the room is empty. My little night light in the corner of the room comforts me back to sleep, except as I closed my eyes I felt a heavy hand patting my shoulder. My eyes rip open and there was no one in the room. As soon as I lay back down, the petting continued and I covered my head, just pretending to myself that it was my mom. It took me 12 years to stop sleeping with my head under the covers because of that memory. My mom, of course, knew a woman passed away in that apartment before we moved in, so she always believed it was that woman trying to comfort me. Story 23. At my mom's old apartment, I used to have this feeling I was always being watched. Then I was starting to wake up at 3 a.m. consistently. On one of the nights I had woken up, I heard someone call out my name. It was a woman's voice, but I didn't recognize it. She kept calling out my name and started walking towards my bed, getting closer, but I couldn't see anything. I freaked out, jumped off my bed, and ran into my brother's room. I hopped into bed with him and tried waking him up. The punk sleeps like the dead. I heard her footsteps follow me until his doorway. After that, every time I woke up in the middle of the night, I just ran into his room and slept on the top bunk. My mother still doesn't believe that happened. Thankfully, we only lived there for a couple of months, then moved out. Story 24. One weekend, I was at my dad's house. He'd come to the upstairs bathroom to get a shave and heard footsteps in my stepsister's room. I thought it was him walking around initially, so I got up to find him standing at her closed door. He looks back at me and whispers, "You can hear that too." I nodded and he opened the door slowly. My stepsister was asleep and never had been awake apparently. There was no way she could have crossed the room, gotten in bed, and pretended to be that convincingly asleep in the 2 seconds it took my dad to open the door. He went in, checked her TV, which had never been on, the radio hadn't been on either. We figured maybe it was the beat of a song or something. After that, we heard the footsteps a bunch of times, usually very early in the morning. Some of the footsteps were so heavy, they'd shake the ceiling fan of the dining room directly under her bedroom, and they'd woken her up a few times as well. Whenever I'd shower at my dad's, I always felt like someone was standing behind me. Eventually, I got so stressed and paranoid that I refused to shower at the house or even go into the upstairs bathroom. My dad asked me one day, "Do you ever feel like someone's in the shower with you when you're here?" After months of me feeling that way and never mentioning it to anyone. Story 25. My aunt has a story of her and her siblings sharing the same experience while in 3 separate rooms. My aunt and I were driving in the town she went to school in. We drove past a house and I remarked how bad it looked. She replied, "It is worse inside. That place is haunted." I had never heard my aunt talk of anything paranormal, and I haven't since. The story goes that the 3 of them rented out some sketchy house while going to school. Apparently, strange things would happen that made them feel uncomfortable, but never anything crazy. They would all notice on a few occasions they would wake up in the night with the blankets off and at the foot of the bed. Nothing strange, people kick off blankets when they get too hot all the time. One night, my aunt recounts that she had a dream she was falling and needed to grab onto something to save herself. She suddenly realized that she wasn't dreaming and she was being pulled by her ankles out of her bed. She grabbed the rails of the headboard and after a few horrifying moments she gets the strength to scream. At the same time she hears screams from her siblings' rooms. Just as soon as it started, the feeling ended and she ran to check on them. They all had the same feeling of being pulled out of their bed. Needless to say, they moved out and didn't look back. Story 26. My stepmom and my dad used to work opposite shifts there for a while. He was on nights, her on days. They had a set of baby monitors from when my sister and I were babies. My dad said they could record short messages with them and they would leave them out on the coffee table for the other to hear when they got home from their shift. This went on for a bit, then once their shifts lined up they put the monitors away in storage. She died of cancer at a really young age and my dad had just gotten back from the funeral and was home alone. He spent that night going through their things, packing some of her stuff away. He said he had one of the baby monitors sitting out on the coffee table and it woke him up in the middle of the night with an old message going off on repeat that she had recorded. It said, "I love you Mike, I love you Mike," over and over. My dad told me he just sat on the couch in the dark and listened to her message until the batteries died. A couple of weeks later, he had picked us kids up for the weekend. After my sister and I went inside, he said he was sitting on the porch smoking and a strong gust of wind blew and he said he could smell her perfume that she always wore. It scared me hearing those stories as a kid, but now I can see the beauty and peace in those experiences. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe to Thread Talk for more content like this. Also, don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss out. Have a dope day and we'll see you in the next video. Cheers!